Hello everyone, and here is a new educational chess game. I'm playing a 15-minute game with a 2-second increment per move, and my opponent starts with a 4. I'm going to play against him. E6, the French defense, which consists of supporting the pawn on d5. So I play d5. If he takes, I recapture with the pawn. But he can also advance, which is what he does, by the way, the advance variation. So now, what should I do? I'm getting squeezed in the center. He has a central space advantage. This pawn on e5 is annoying. I can't play nf6, I can't play bishop d6. So I need to attack his center. How to do it? Either the f6 push or the c5 push. But the f6 push could compromise the safety of my king. Generally, it's played after trying the c5 push. Because if he takes, I recapture with the bishop. That develops my bishop nicely on a very good diagonal. So he plays c3. And here, usually we play knight c6, then queen b6, increasing the pressure on the pawn d4. At the same time, the queen on b6 attacks b2, so that the bishop can't come to defend the pawn on d4. But the opponent still has ways to defend this pawn on d4. It's not impossible for him to manage to defend it. So what I'm going to do is not start with knight to c6. You'll see I'm going to start with queen b6. Pressure on d4, pressure on b2. I'm really tempted to play knight c6, but not right away. First, I'm going to play bishop d7. Because it's my bishop that's the least active because of this pawn blockade, this pawn chain on the white squares. So the idea is to bring it to b5. To exchange it for his own bishop, which could otherwise be placed aggressively on d3. So if I exchange these two bishops, it's a trade that benefits me. And only after that will I play knight c6. There we go. He played bishop e2 and I play bishop b5. I'm offering to exchange my bad bishop for his. And after that, my knight will have that square on c6. You see, I didn't want to play knight c6 right away. Now I exchange. So the price to pay for my strategy is a delay in development, that's clear. But since the center is closed, my development delay isn't really that noticeable. And so now I'm looking at knight c6. I'm going to play it. The knight on g8 does not have access to the square f6, but it can have access to the square f5 to put pressure on d4. The bishop can go to the square e7 and kingside castling. Now the problem. When you play the knight to f5, it's that the knight can sometimes be chased away by the g4 pawn push. So yes, it weakens the protection of white's kingside castling, but since he has the central space advantage, I don't really have the means in the end to easily reach his king. And my queen is on the other side. And my knight still loses 2 squares after this move g4. He plays rook d1. He overprotects the pawn on d4. This is what we call prophylaxis in chess. Prophylaxis is the art of curing the problem before it happens. It's the overprotection of weak points. So he's managing the protection of his pawn on d4. So should I exchange on d4 first, or should I play knight e7? If I play knight e7, I leave him to take on c5 without my bishop being able to retake. I'll have to recapture with my queen. I prefer to take on d4 first, even though I know that recapturing with the pawn gives him a broken pawn structure with 3, which he didn't have before. Maybe that's a mistake. Maybe I should have played knight to e7 first. I don't know. Now I play knight to e7 to come to f5 and triple the attacks on d4. If I want to guard against the pawn push, g4, h5 is a good option. It may seem strange, but it's a good option. Here, I can play knight f5 right away because since I'm attacking 3 times, if he plays g4, obviously the knight will take on d4. So knight f5. I'm still a bit behind in development. My king is lingering in the center, but since the center is closed, I can afford to keep it there for now. Perhaps queen d3, aiming for knight takes d5, pawn takes, then queen takes f5. Queen to d3, it protects d4 and prepares this combination. You see knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes. That's annoying. So queen to d3, I don't know what I'm going to play. I still do not really want to play g6 just to protect my knight like that. It's possible, but I would weaken the dark squares around my kingside. So I really like the squares on the dark side, of course, but I feel like this isn't a very good way to play. He plays queen b5. He proposes to exchange queen. Why not queen takes, knight takes? He threatens the fork on c7. I can play king d7 to counter it. He can play kdg5 to take me on f7 though. But I can play f6. Then we take his knight moves. His knight can take on e6. King takes, and then he makes the fork on c7. Well, maybe his knight won't get out. I go back to d7. He takes, my bishop comes out, and he'll lose the other knight. So he'll have taken my rook, but he'll still lose both his knights. And what if I did? Knight takes d4. If he takes my queen, I take his knight with check before taking back. On knight takes d4. If he takes, it won't work for me. I can't take because I'm pinned. So that doesn't work. Knight takes d4. And you see on queen takes, knight takes, as soon as I play a move like king d7 to control the c7 square, I was talking about knight g5, but there's also g4 that could come, pushing back my knight. I can't take on d4, it's too well protected. If I go to h6, there could be h3. My knight isn't doing much. He always has the possible knight g5. But I'm going to recalculate the variation. Queen takes, knight takes, king d7. If he plays g5, he attacks the pawn f7. I can still defend it with knight d8, because the idea is afterwards I push his knight back with a6. He won't be able to hold on. The square d6 is controlled twice. And his move knight g5 weakens his pawn d4, by the way. By the way, after queen takes, knight takes, king d7, knight g5, I have knight d8, which defends. It looks fine. I'm going to take his queen. Since there are no more queens on the board, it's perfectly fine to play with a king in the center, especially since the central file is completely blocked. So I play king, d7 with the idea of playing a 6. I couldn't play a6 right away because of the fork. So now let's see. Is he going to attack the pawn on f7 with knight g5? And if knight g5, we'll have to consider the push to f6 or king d8 to defend the pawn more passively. f7 before pushing back the knight b5 with a6 and pushing back the knight g5 with h6. Besides, his pawn on d4 is still being targeted. He plays a3. So let's immediately push back his knight. Then, I push back his knight, but he comes to c3. He'll come back to a4. He'll look for the fork on b6. Even if I put my rook on c8, there will always be forks. So it's not pleasant either. And he has this push to g4, which can also happen. And what if I played f6, capture, capture? Then I have to expect moves like f4. It's very unpleasant that for now I don't really want to chase his knight on b5. Because if I chase his knight on b5 with a6, I weaken this square b6, which I'll have to control a bit later. Here I can't increase the pressure on d4. I might play h5 to keep my knight on f5. And if I play knight g5, certainly knight d8. But I wouldn't be able to push back the knight on g5 now. Not easily. So after h5, knight g5, I could maybe still play f6. Then we said knight takes, king takes, knight c7, check, king d7, knight takes rook, bishop moves, and his knight will have to be eliminated. Otherwise, bishop e7. On g4, I have the h4 square, protected by my bishop. Listen, I'm going to play bishop e7. It connects my rooks. It seems like the normal move. And he plays g4, so knight h4. I need to check knight takes bishop, takes. He can play g5 to prevent my bishop from coming back, but I have h6. Here he has no choice but to take. So I take back. He comes to g2, and I'm going to retreat quickly because I'm afraid my bishop might get trapped. So I go back to a7. And you see, for now, I'm refraining from playing a 6 because his knight is under control. And that's a bit of a knee-jerk move. That is to say, I don't accept the position of his knight, and right away I want to push it back. But I'm telling you, nc3, nd4, nb6, that's going to be hard to control. We can control it, but it's going to be troublesome. But his knight on b5 for now isn't bothering me. I'm keeping an eye on d4, forcing the rook to defend. Because if the rook moves, then I'll play a 6 because I'll take the d4 pawn. He plays f4, and now I'm thinking about h5, and actually I'm going to play it. I'm trying to open the h-file. If I play g5, I play g6, and the accumulation of pawns on dark squares is increasingly hindering his dark square bishop. Well, mine too, but the difference is that his dark square bishop won't be able to attack. My pawns are on white square. Whereas in some endgames, my bishop can maneuver around the position after some piece exchanges, and my bishop will still be able to find targets. So I play g6. My dream now is to trade the bishop for his knight and place my knight on f5, especially if he has played h4, because the knight will put pressure on d4 and h4. With all my pawns on white square, his dark square bishop will have nothing to bite into. And in fact, he plays h4, you see. So I need to carry out this maneuver. But how do I exchange the dark square bishop for the knight? Maybe bishop to d8, a 6, knight to c3, and bishop to a5, for example, to exchange it. But be careful, because if I play bishop d8 right away, he goes into d6. So we'll start with a 6. Knight c3, certainly, bishop d8. That allows me to control b6 if he wants to play. Knight f4, nowhere else. And then on knight c3, I can play b5 so that he doesn't go into a 4. He plays knight to c3. Should I play b5 right away? I have to consider it. He might try to play a4. I don't want to put my pawns on a dark square. And taking would open the file for him, and he would attack a6 afterwards. If I play bishop d8, bishop d5, then b4, piling pawns on a dark square, after fd8, then fd6, attacking d4. So I'm going to play fd8. I free up the square from my knight, and my bishop can settle on b6. And there I'll have maximum pressure on these backward pawns h4 and d4. As for the rook, they will be placed on the c-file, of course. So bishop a5, he's going to play b4 against me, that's for sure. So I look bishop a5, b4, bishop b6, b5, knight e7, capture, capture, and he's going to put a rook on b1 to attack my bishop. But I can put a rook on b8 to contest. If I play b5, it's a4 that bothered me. It still bothers me. In fact, if I play bishop b6 right away, knight a4. But it's the same, bishop a5, b4, bishop b6. I'm going to get knight a4. Bishop retreats, and he's going to come into c5. It's annoying because if there's a capture, he recaptures with the pawn on b and opens the file to attack b7. So I would need to manage to play b5. But a4 bothers me. Really, that move bothers me. I don't want to play b4. Maybe I have to play it, but b4, what is he going to do with his knight? I don't know, knight a2. And then maybe we can push a5 or play something else. No, maybe it's okay, b5, a4, b4. That is, I have a bishop on dark square, so I do not really want to put my pawns on dark square actually, because that blocks my bishop, and putting a pawn on b4 blocks both my bishop and my knight. They won't be able to use the square anymore. But if it pushes his knight back, why not? All right, I'll play b5. That way there's no more knight a4. I'm going to play bishop b6, knight e7, knight f5, the rook's on the c-file. That should be fine. So since my knight is on f5, he has a bishop f2 to defend both weaknesses. Sign on, I also have the squares c4 and b3 with knight a5, knight c4, knight b3. That could be interesting. He plays king f2. Alors, what's good is that if my knight is on f5, he can no longer defend the pawn with the king or the bishop. He will have to put the rook. So I really want to play knight in e7. All right, I'm going to play knight e7. Now he'll have to come back right away to defend the pawn on h4. The problem is that I'm really showing him my intentions now to come to f5. I wanted to keep this move for last, but, well, it was very tempting to play it now. Knight f5 now. So he can play king g3 and knight f5. Check king h3. But his king is deprived of play. But I'm attacking his bishop as well. So he can't even play king g3, actually. He can play king f3, and after knight f5, bishop f2. That's the right way for him to defend. And now I play bishop b6 to attack d4 twice. Well, he defends twice with the bishop and the rook, but after that I put my rooks on the c-file. And then I try to get into c4 to triple the attacks on his backward pawn on d4. You see, that's it. That's the idea, actually. Since he has the bishop on the dark square, I put his pawn is on a dark square, which gives me targets, whereas his bishop on the dark square can only defend. It can't attack my pawns. And so on a4, b4, he goes back to h1 to defend, but here the rook is very passive, really, really passive. We're going to play bishop b6, threatening knight f5 with the double attack on the backward pawn on d4 and the attack on the pawn on h4. Now my rooks can be placed on the c-file. He plays king e2. And on kf5, he's going to play king d3. I'm looking, I have entries on g3 to attack his rook, but I do not think that brings me anything. I'm going to put a rook on the c-file. I'll put the rook from h8. I find that it's not doing anything on h8, so I prefer to put it on c8. The rook on a8 is not doing much more, but you never know if there are moves like a4 that the position opens up. I might be glad to have the rook on the a-file. He plays king d3. And now, if I play rook, c4, he's going to play b3. If I play bishop f5, he'll play b4. But I'd be happy because I'd have the c4 square now. But still, I'm being cautious. Bishop f5, b4. I go back to b6, and then he plays a 4. And he attacks b5 twice. I'm going to put the knight on f5. He can play bishop f2. That will defend the h4 pawn, and the rook can come back into the fight. But I haven't found anything better. He plays knight a2. Why does he play that? He wants to come back to b4. But here I play rook c4. I attack the pawn on d4 3 times. He can play b3 because I don't really want to take the pawn on d4 with my rook. And after that, he'll want to put the knight on b4 to attack a6. And if I take his dark squared bishop right away, takes rook c4, then he doesn't have time to play. b3, he has to defend d4. For example, he'll defend with rook d1. I double the rooks. Maybe he'll play kd before now to attack the pawn on a6. I can play a5. And the knight is actually forced to go back to a2. I come into c2. That's interesting. I don't want to trade the knight for the bishop of dark square, but maybe I'll have to do it for very concrete reasons. Here. Because after rook c4, he plays b3, I'm forced to retreat. On the other hand, after knight takes, king takes, rook c4, if I play b3, I can do it. Rook takes d4, or even bishop takes d4 check to attack his rook as well. So after king d1, king takes rook c4, he's forced to play rook d1. And that gives me the tempo to play. Rook c8, the other rook to c8, and to have doubled the rooks on the file. I'm going to play it like that. So I take his bishop on the dark square. You see, you should always accept exchanges that may seem strategically inferior if you think that tactically they bring you something very concrete. So rook c4, I attack d4. So he plays rook d1 as we expected, rook c8. I double the rooks on the file. If I play b3, I come into c2, and I can even go around the position now. If I play king b4, a5, I don't see any square for his knight except a2. If he goes to d3, he won't protect d4 anymore, which interferes with the rook's defense of the pawn. And on c2, I take, of course. So you see how my 2 rooks are superior to his 2 rooks, and how my bishop is superior to his knight for now. He plays rook c1, he's allowed to play. That bishop takes d4, check, rook takes, knight takes, rook takes, and I've won a pawn. I'm going to do that. Bishop takes d4 check, and my pressure on d4 ends up making me win that pawn. So I don't have much time left, but there are 2 seconds added per move, which will allow me to finish this game. So he recaptures with the rook, and I take revenge on the upper rook. Knight takes, rook takes. He'll have a rook on d4, I'll have a rook on c1, I'll have penetrated his camp and won his pawn on d4, giving me the protected passed pawn on d5, even if, for now, it can't advance. It's still an undeniable advantage for the rest of the game. If he moves his king, I can trade rooks, I can take on b2. I have all possible options. And you see how my bishop on dark square ends up triumphing. I told you earlier that this pawn structure was suffocating. My bishop on dark square, but that I could maneuver to get around it in the endgame. That's what happened with the placement on b6 to attack d4, that weakness. I had the knight on f5 attacking d4 and h4, and I ended up trading my very beautiful knight for his bad bishop, which was very passive, but for very concrete reasons. This is the transition from strategy to tactics, of course. He plays king d3, and I'm going to exchange everything recaptures. And then take on b2, or come to f2 to take on h4. What is he going to take, the rook or the knight? But both are losing. So here I exchange rooks, and the endgame with my bishop against his knight is winning for me, because he actually has weaknesses on black squares everywhere. I'm spoiled for choice between taking on b2 and, well, he takes the bishop on d4. I wasn't expecting that, but he gives up the exchange. So now I can play rook c2, attack over here, or rook h1 to go take the pawn h4. What is he going to want to play? He's going to want to play knight b4 to get revenge on a6. Rook c2, knight b4, rook takes b2, knight takes a6. But I also have rook c4, check. King e3. And maybe a5 to stop his knight. I have plenty of winning moves here. But I'm going to go to h1. I'm going to take the pawn on h4, because that will give me a distant passed pawn. Plus, after knight b4, I can play a5, and in the end, he doesn't win anything at all. But here, I'm going to get this distant passed pawn. It will be very difficult for him to deal with this pawn. Let's not forget that if the king comes to take care of the h-pawn, I have the d-pawn, which is also a passed pawn. So his king and his knight will have to hold the h5 pawn and the d5 pawn. But meanwhile, my rook will be able to ravage his other pawns. He plays klc3, so I take h4. And now I attack the pawn on f4. If he plays king e3, I play rook check, and I even take his knight. Here I'm threatening. Rook c4, check to take his knight. I can simplify the position now. It's winning for me. Come on, I push the pawn. I'm going for a queen. He's trying to flag me, but with the 2-second increment and an extra queen, it'll be easy. So if he plays knight e2, he'll want to come to g3 to control. Knight to e2, I play rook f3, so I don't let him have it. The g3 square, actually. Or rook g4 to attack the g5 pawn. He takes here, I push the pawn. And the queen is about to arrive. He plays b4, I play the queen. What was his rating? 1789 ELO. Isn't that the French Revolution? So he puts the knight on d6. Let's give a little check. Here, I might not play very precisely because I don't have much time, but I'll still try to win quickly. So he advances, rook, check. The king will have to come here. I'm going to take the pawn on a 3. So I couldn't take on b5. There's the knight. If the pawn advances, queen a6 check, that's going to bother him. King b8, and then we'll checkmate on a8. King b8, queen a8 mate. And that's how we finish. So the computer gives me 92% accuracy versus 86% for my opponent. And you can see it indicates a blunder. It considers that indeed at one point I had a nice advantage, and I played a move that compromised my advantage, even though I still had a superior position. Let's take a look. So my opponent plays e4, e6, the French defense. So d4, d5, the advanced variation, c5, c3, queen b6, knight f3. And here I don't play. Knight c6, immediately I play my little variation fd7, fb5. A small positional variation that can destabilize French defense players. Advanced variation. I'm going to get rid of my bad bishop. So he plays bishop e2, bishop b5. He plays kingside castling, so he has managed his development well. You can't say he did anything wrong in the opening. He developed well. But I exchange my bad bishop for his good bishop. And now I send knight c6. The computer says it's better to take on d4 before playing knight to c6. Because here it suggests moves like d takes c5, bishop takes, then b4. But my bishop goes back to e7, but it's true that on e7 IGN brought out the knight. If the knight comes out to h6, Yafu takes. So here the computer told me that I needed to exchange on d4 before playing knight c6, because after the capture on c5, it would bring out my bishop Mada. But there was this possibility to play b4 afterwards to attack, try to take the initiative, maybe even play c4 at some point to open up the position. Well, now I know. I would take on d4 before playing knight to c6. Actually, that's what I usually do, but here I didn't want to give him the kc3 for his knight. That's why I didn't exchange on d4. I wanted to change things up a bit, but it's true that usually I take d4 when playing. K to d6 without really knowing why, actually, just because I had seen it. But now I understand why. You see, on king to d6, pawn takes, and on queen takes or bishop takes, maybe the b4 push. Well, it's not catastrophic yet, but the computer gives white an advantage. Now I know, whereas on the capture on d4, the advantage for white is very minimal. It's simply a white advantage, like we often see in openings. I played king to delta 6, and he didn't take on Charlie 5. Psychologically, it's not easy for white to take on c5 either, because it allows the bishop to develop, and it weakens the protection of the pawn on e5, even if the computer considers that this is the best continuation here. And he played rook to delta 1 to overprotect the pawn on d4. So at that point, I started to take. I played king to delta 7, he played knight to delta Charlie 3, a knight to foxtrot 5, the triple attack on the pawn on d4. I focused everything on this backward pawn. So yes, there's no open file to attack it, so it's a backward pawn, but a hidden one because my rooks can't attack it, so it's less weak than a real backward pawn. That's true, I admit it, but it's still a target. He plays queen b5, offering a queen's exchange. And here I'm going to accept. Queen takes b5, knight takes b5. So you have to accept, but you have to realize there's this threat of a fork on c7. So I play king d7, accepting the king in the center, since we're in the endgame and the d file is completely blocked. He plays a3. If he had played king to d5, the computer gives several moves. It suggests a6, king d8, with a black advantage each time. Well, he played a3. I played bishop e7, and then he pushes g4. So knight to h4. Here, the exchange of knights is practically forced for him. He plays king g2, and I prefer to return to my position with bishop e7. He pushes f4, and here I play h5. I tell myself that after the g5 push in the end, the king side will close in my favor because he'll lock his pawns on a dark square. If he captures, I recapture with the rook and open a file to play against the isolated h2 pawn. Maybe the best for him would have been to play h3, but h3. I can still take on g4 and open the file anyway in favor of my rooks. Knowing that he has trouble contesting the file with his own rook, because I can play a 6 and take on d4 afterwards if his rook on d1 is no longer there. So h5 is played and he plays g5. I play g6. He plays h4. So for me that's a mistake because he's going to give me a target with knight e7, knight f5. A target on h4. There was already the target on d4. Here I end up pushing back his knight by a6, knight c3. And the maneuver with bishop d8. I want to replace my bishop on b6. He plays bishop e3. I played b5. On the push a4, it's the best move according to the computer, by the way, for white. But black are still better, as you can see on the analysis bar. And the computer considers that the best line is not b4, even though it's still better for black. It's bishop a5. But you have to deal with the complications based on the capture on b5, of course, which attacks the knight. For me, on a4, I would have played b4. Anyway, it's still an advantage for black, and I found that safer for me. He plays king f2, so knight e7 to get to f5. I was very surprised to see rook h1 come in. I thought he was going to play king e2 on knight f5, bishop f2. So he plays rook h1, but that's pretty passive for his rook. I place the bishop on b6. The king comes to e2. I put the rook on c8. The king comes to d3. Knight f5, that puts pressure all over the position, and then he retreats to a2, and that's not a good move for him. The computer tells me I have to play knight takes bishop, and that's what I did. Knight takes bishop immediately, king takes, and rook c4. He comes to defend with rook d1, and then I play rook c8, and that's where the computer criticizes my move. The computer says I should have played rook c2. It's true that it's interesting. Rook c2 attacks b2, it restricts my rook. Sometimes it can also go around to attack the pawn on h4. But since the rook on a8 wasn't playing, I played rook c8. And actually, after rook c8, my evaluation drops, as you can see. It's still better for me, but it goes down. And the computer says that the right move now for white is knight c3. By the way, it's the only way for white to be able to hold the position. But I was actually thinking of playing bishop 5, in fact, in the position. So I don't see why it would hold. Well, yes, it holds, because after that he can come back to e2 and defend d4. But I can still infiltrate on c2. I think it's still better for me, this position. So I should have played rook c2 anyway. Well, I played rook c8. He didn't play knight c3. He played rook c1, and there on the other hand, he gave me a pawn because I was able to play bishop takes d4, check. And there I was expecting rook takes and to take his rook here. In the end, he plays king d3, I take his rook. Anyway, everything is lost for him, even if he had taken on d4. He takes, I take back there. I was expecting knight takes and to play bishop, take on b2, or bishop f2 to take on h4. It's totally winning. In the end, he decides to take my bishop. And the rook is much stronger, obviously rook h1. I'm going to take the pawn. h4 to have this passed pawn. You saw the end. It's pretty easy to win now. You just have to go and make another queen. Don't hesitate to leave me likes, comments, share the video, and support the channel. Goodbye, everyone.